Okay, so hopefully we are live. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here. Today we are pleased to welcome a very special guest, Dr. Mohidul Islam, Assistant Professor of Political Science from Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. His specialization is political theory, South Asian politics, cinema studies, and a various number of things. He is the author of two monographs, Indian Muslims after liberalization and limits of Islamism, Jamaati Islam in contemporary India and Bangladesh. With that, I ask all of you to give full attention to Dr. Mohidul Islam. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. I'm really honored to be here with you in a new platform called the StreamYard. I've been rather technologically challenged in the last few years, but I have learned these kinds of technologies by from the next generation. And also the context has really made us learn. I am not going to talk anything about political theory or identity politics that has been so far my interest in the last two books that you have mentioned. What I'm going to do today is basically look at the history of political science in India. It's a part of a project, an institutional project funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And I will be rather grateful to get comments from you. And so this is something which I thought that I could share with some of you, since some of you are students of history. This is not historical stuff, but this has some kind of some phases of history that you could relate to. So my paper is called Decolonization Meets Globalization, Politics and Political Science in Contemporary India. I will get something around an hour, or can I? Hello? I can't hear you. Okay.
Yes, sir, it's fine. So can you hear me?
Can I get an hour? Yeah, I can hear you now. Can I get an hour? It's fine
Yes,
if you
sir.
just put it here. It's fine if you just put it like this. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that it's better to coordinate, because since you are the moderator, it's better to coordinate. Okay. Political science as a distinct discipline in India emerged only in the 1920s. The political science department in the Calcutta University was inaugurated in 1948, a year after India's independence from British colonial rule. In this respect, this paper will especially highlight three important phases of disciplinary history of political science and three macro-level parallel political trends in contemporary India. 1947 to 1977, that's the first phase. 1977 to 1999, the second phase. And finally, the 1999 to 2019, the final phase. It will connect the evolution of Indian politics and Indian political science from the middle decades of the 20th century that overlapped with the process of decolonization to the arrival and consolidation of globalization by the end of the 20th century and during the first two decades of the 21st century. In effect, the paper will intertwine the parallel careers of Indian politics and Indian political science. Firstly, this paper will look at the 3 decades of decolonization from 1948 to 1977 in the aftermath of India's political freedom. The middle decades of the 20th century, overlapping with the decolonial age, can be further subdivided into two periods, 1948 to 1967 and 1967 to 1977. The period of 1948 to 1967 could be regarded as the moment of arrival of nationalist phase with a unique interest in constitutionalism and constitutional history in Indian political science, with a core focus on normative and historical approaches. It was also the time of electoral dominance of the Indian National Congress, the prime agent of the Indian national movement. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Indian constitution became the topic of discussion among Indian political scientists. However, from the late 1960s onwards, there was a visible shift from the disciplinary practices of constitutional studies and normative political thought to Marxism and behavioralism in the form of structural function analysis and application of empirical political science, particularly in studying party systems and voting behavior. While the normative and historical approaches were still informing the Marxist circles, election analysis and comparative politics became the forte of the behavioral political scientists in India. It was also the new political moment when regional and left parties challenged the electoral dominance of the Congress party in various Indian provinces. Thus, the post 1967 period was different from the earlier phase of decolonization when Indian constitutional studies became prominent as a specific response to the emergence of a post colonial state. The second phase of Indian political science, 1977 to 1999, was living with the after effects of decolonization with specific role of vernacularism in higher education and as a result, using of regional languages in the teaching and research in political science. The broad themes of research in political science was particularly targeted against the modern Indian state with special emphasis on a critique of the Nehruvian model of Indian state and political economy. At the political level, this was a phase that witnessed the fragmentation of the Congress party, the consolidation of regional parties, including the left parties, along with the rise of a far-right Bharatiya Janata Party in the context of neoliberal economic reforms in the domain of political economy, and the rise of Mandir and Mandal politics during the 1990s. Thirdly, in the third phase, 1999 to 2019, Indian political scientists witnessed the momentous upheaval and consolidation of the BJP, the collapse of the Congress, the decline of the left, and the continuous existence of regional parties in Indian politics. At the level of institution building, several private universities were being set up right from 1990s, which became a norm from the first decade of the 21st century, completely in sync with the political and economic agenda of neoliberal establishment in India. Now, this is the introductory kind of introduction to the paper, that the major content that I'm going to talk. So now we come to the different sections of the paper. The first section, which I'm now saying, is decolonization and making of public universities. The 20th century national universities emerged out of specific political programs for national education in the early 20th century and broader institutional efforts to codify, regulate, and support regional or vernacular public spheres. It was during the first 2 decades of the 20th century that major Indian universities were established. These include the Banaras Hindu University in 1916, Osmania University in 1918, Aligarh Muslim University in 1920, Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi in 1922, in 1920, the University of Lucknow in 1921, the University of Dhaka in 1921, and the University of Delhi in 1922. This group of universities in India emerged after the earlier generation of prominent higher education institutions that were established in the 19th century. These include the Presidency Universities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras in 1858, the University of Allahabad in 1887, and the Hindu College in 1817, later renamed as the Presidency College in 1855. Political science as a separate discipline in India emerged only in the 1920s. The first department of political science was established in Lucknow University in 1921, and the second oldest department of political science in India was opened in 1927 at the University of Allahabad. The political science department in the Calcutta University was established in 1948. The Department of Political Science at Calcutta was a contemporary of the Department of Political Science at Osmania University in Hyderabad, established during 1947-48, the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Pune University, established in 1949, and the Department of Political Science at Delhi University in 1952. But before moving to the actual happenings and narratives of the teaching and research interests of these two departments, we need to first understand decolonization both as a conceptual tool and as a process. Decolonization has a longer history and a shorter history. The longer history is being told by David Strang by meticulously examining the global patterns of decolonization in the breakdown of Western overseas empires between 1500 and 1987. So this is quite a longer history. It's almost 387 years. And marking the interval between the start and end of colonial dependency of Western power, along with noting whether such colonial dependencies were later submerged with other colonies or became completely independent. According to Strang, and I quote, one of the fundamental regularities of the Western state system seems to be the transition from colonial dependency to sovereignty. Beginning with Britain's continental colonies in 1783 and ending with the Caribbean islands of St. Kitts and Nevis in 1983, 165 colonial dependencies have become new independent states or have been fully incorporated into existing sovereign states. As a central feature of the expansion of the Western state system, decolonization finds a parallel only in the process of imperial conquest and colonization. It is far more central than the recognition of non-Western states as sovereign members of the Western family of nations, which occurs only a handful of times, unquote. The shorter history of decolonization finds it a process that started by challenging the Anglo-European colonialism roughly from 1870s, when the decline of the erstwhile colonial powers first started to take shape. This is a view that we could get from Strang, who uses an event history analysis to explain the correlates of decolonization by tracing it temporally. His methodology is primarily quantitative in nature. His research design tries to understand how the rate of decolonization varied with specific changes in the world economy and the world polity. Thus, he traces two phases of decolonization. The early one during the period of 1870 to 1945, and the late form in the post-Second World War decades, particularly during 1945 to 1987. His broad conclusion is that from the vantage point of world economy, the rate of decolonization rose during the period of American hegemony. Seen from the world polity side, decolonization was more rapid, where suffrage regimes were broad, along with emergence of nationalism in the European colonies, and after 1960, when imperialism in the form of direct rule and control was delegitimized in global political discourse. Colonialism rested on the projected superiority of the European civilizational values, and such a discourse was a key point around which colonial power was legitimized. The internationalized disillusionment of the post World War I period encouraged alternative ideas of civilization aligned to decolonization movements, as pointed out by Prasenjit Duara. According to Duara, one of the major changes wrought in the concept of civilization in the 20th century was that there was no single civilization, but multiple civilizations. This new conception of multiple civilizational poles was opposed to the 19th century European conception of it as singular and based on material progress. The idea that there were multiple civilizations and that civilization also has spiritual and moral concerns became widely accepted. The decolonizing process resulted in some fundamental transformations in the concept of civilization, as a result of which Lucia Febvre has called an ethnographic concept. Franz Fanon elaborates it more appropriately by saying that there are civilizations without neckties, civilization with loincloths, and others without hats. Fanon quotes it from A Dying Colonialism. As the idea of civilization was liberated from its ties to the cosmology of progress, Oriental as well as Occidental intellectuals sought to find the distinctive civilizational traditions among the people of their own native place. Such a discourse eventually challenged European colonialism and ultimately delegitimized its very foundation. From a very different perspective, A.G. Hopkins has drawn our attention to the states which were under dominion status in the Pax Britannica. Dominion status, according to Hopkins, was a colonial invention to distinguish states that were self-governing colonies of white settlement from other parts of the empire that remained subject to imperial rule. According to Hopkins, the ceremonial transfer of power, followed by a change of flag from the Union Jack or the national anthems of these states, were significant because these states retained a subordinate relationship with the empire, which was trying to maintain its hierarchical structure for almost a decade after the formal ending of the war until it abandoned the colonial policies. Hopkins highlights that Britain tried to revitalize the empire by strengthening its racial ties with the dominions in the intermediate post-war years through policies like subsidizing emigration to the dominions while maintaining strong economic ties through a substantial amount of mutual trade. This helped to maintain the supremacy of the pan-Britannic identity in the dominions and also a strong British influence in their economies, and prevented the formation of a national identity in the immediate post-war years. In terms of military and defense policy, they were severely constrained and depended on external support for the initial years. However, as the Cold War took shape, the dominions were gradually incorporated in the global plan devised by the US and the USSR, and the old colonial empire gradually lost its relevance. Due to a series of domestic political and economic crises, Britain gradually started pulling itself out from the overseas dominions. It was around this time, as Hopkins points out, that the public discourse changed against racism and colonialism in favor of civic republicanism, thereby stressing upon the need for an emphasis on democracy and human rights. As a result, the dominions gradually started changing their domestic policy from an assimilationist to an inclusionary one. This was also marked by the fact that Britain itself rejected the Pax Britannica and joined the European Union gradually, and the global scenario had changed with the rise of two new global hegemons in the post-war period. It was during the middle decades of the 20th century that a national identity started growing in the dominions, who did not reproduce Britain's class-based society and started devising their own economic and foreign policies. This resulted in the transformation of the global order from a hierarchical one dominated by empires to a more horizontal and democratic one situated to the norms of civic republicanism. This perspective of Hopkins is methodologically different from Strang. However, it points out a similar trend and highlights that a combination of global political and global economic perspectives can be applied to better understand the minutest details of decolonization, even in the case of the dominions. If we read Strang, Duara, and Hopkins together, we can argue that, that decolonization can be best understood from an intersection of world polity and world economic perspectives. Strang and Hopkins follow a very different methodology, such that the former is purely statistical, which is Strang, and the latter is more interpretivist. However, both reach a consensus and agree that the alteration of global norms have facilitated decolonization. Duara's argument of multiple civilizations supports Strang's empirical observation of a change in political discourse in favor of civic republicanism, having a positive correlation with decolonization, which in turn supplements Hopkins' argument of national identity construction and the emergence of an alternative historiography in the dominions following a change in global norms against the colonialist discourse of Pax Britannica. The world economy and the world polity approaches are indeed co-constituted, and this is where an intersectional approach can be very useful to comprehend the changes in the global structure. Contrary to realist assumptions of a global anarchy or a purely economic critique of the world system, a constructivist epistemology is necessary to better understand how changing norms can alter structures at the unitary and systemic level. These readings have indeed contributed some novel perspectives to the scholars of decolonization. In this respect, the early phase of decolonization was expressed in India with the formulation of core periphery theories in Dadabhai Nauroji's paper, Poverty of India, read before the Bombay branch of the East India Association and was published from Bombay by Ranima Union Press in 1876, later to be part of his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, published in 1901. Nauroji tried to conceptually understand colonization as an exploitative system, but at the same time, his remarks were absolutely in sync with the later nationalist leaders of India during the first half of the 20th century. In this regard, the first organized and modern political expression of early decolonization, I would argue, in British India was the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885. Now I come to the second section of the paper, which is called Indian Constitutional Studies and the Nationalist Movement of Political Science, 1948 to 1967. And this is where the real content of the paper starts, because as I know, as I was arguing that India became independent in 1947, formal political independence and political science departments in Calcutta started in 48, in Pune it started in 49, Osmania in South started in 47, 48, and Delhi University in the North in 52. So 4 departments, Calcutta in East, Osmania in South, Pune in West, and Delhi in North. These are the four departments that we could take. I mean, I would take rather in this research project. Of course, this project is evolving, so it's always better to get feedback. So we can discuss it during the question and answer session. The political science in India in the 1950s and 1960s was dominated by normative political theory with British and European influences. For example, in the 1950s and 1960s, the political science department in Calcutta was mainly focusing on constitutional history, political philosophy, and law, with particular emphasis on international law. While the decades of the 1950s and 1960s still had the imprint of Western epistemological interests, the nationalist movements in the Department of Political Science at Calcutta were prominent. In Calcutta, the nationalist expression was in the form of research interests in the Indian Constitution. Devendranath Banerjee, mostly known as D.N. Banerjee, who moved from Dhaka to Calcutta, was a major figure in setting up the political science department at the Calcutta University. Professor Banerjee, the founding head of the Department of Political Science at Calcutta, was an expert in the Indian Constitution and was one of the pioneering scholars who contributed to the making of Indian constitutional studies. He was the author of several books and articles with particular interest on Indian constitution and East Pakistan politics. Banerjee was also active in the professional organization called the Indian Political Science Association, IPSA, that was established in 1938. In 1938, the political science department in Dhaka was also established during the British India, the undivided India. In the 7th Indian Political Science Conference in Jaipur, held between 2nd January and 4th January 1945, Banerjee was still in Dhaka and his paper, The Kaplan Scheme, was read in the conference in absentia. The IPSA conference from 26 to 28 December 1950 had a significant focus on the new constitution of India, and Banerjee read a paper on fundamental rights. In IPSA conference in December 1951 in Osmania University, Hyderabad, and in December 1952 in Aligarh Muslim University, Banerjee served as an executive member of IPSA and the member of the editorial board of the Indian Journal of Political Science. The interest in the Indian constitutional studies was a recurrent theme in the IPSA conferences in the 1950s and 1960s. Thus, the phase of 1948 to 1967 could be regarded as the moment of decolonization and the arrival of the nationalist phase with the unique culture of constitutionalism and constitutional history of Indian political science. Indian constitution became the new pole of discussion during the phase of decolonization in this period, and this is what I call the after independent India, this is the most important decolonization phase. At the same time, it must be worth remembering that Indian politics during this phase of 1947 to 1967 was characterized as what Rajani Kothari called the Congress system, a party system with an absolute dominance of the grand old party of India. Now, the second phase of decolonization in India, so 47 to 67 was the first phase, and the second phase, for 67 to 77, which I call where a different research interests took shape among Indian political scientists. And this is which I'm now going to highlight. It is interesting to note that only from the 1970s onwards, the focus on constitutional studies and political philosophy shifted to behavioral and empirical political science, supposedly the decade of the post-behavioral trend. This was due to the intervention of some teachers who were trained in American universities, while some were interested in comparative politics and election studies. Along with the behavioral political science, which is empirical political science, that emerged late in India, the presence of Marxist and socialist studies was also emerging from the early 1970s. This was due to the changing pattern of Indian politics, with the left emerging as a credible anti-Congress force in some states from the late 1960s. This was also a time of intense political debates within the Indian left between the pro-Soviet line and the pro-Chinese line, which later had an impact on the teaching and research interests among Indian political scientists. From late 1960s and early 1970s onwards, there was a visible shift in the discursive practices of many political scientists in India, with some interest in Marxism on the one hand and behavioralism on the other. This was also the new political moment that was distinct from the earlier phase of decolonization in the wake of Indian constitutional studies as a specific response to the emergence of a post-colonial state. Now I come to the third section of the paper, which is called Living with Vernacularism, the After Effects of Decolonization, 1977 to 1999. The colonial political rulers packed their bags by 1950. The brown sides were still hovering around in the 1950s and 1960s. Linguistic nationalism in the 1950s and 1960s coincided with the decolonial age and the rapid decline of the English-educated brown sibes. In the political realm, decolonization was first expressed in the form of linguistic reorganization of the states in the mid-1950s and later as a volcanic upsurge against the country's oldest party by late 1960s. These were regional protests often orchestrated by local vernacular elites against the centralized, dynastic, and anglicized elites of the Congress Party, directed explicitly against the Nehru-Gandhi family and their faithful and sycophant fixers. West Bengal was not an exception from such an anti-Congress and decolonial political trend. By the time anti-Congress politics was gaining ground at the provincial level, one eminent social science research institute was already established in Delhi with the able leadership of Rajni Kothari, the Center for the Study of Developing Society, popularly known as CSDS, in 1963. After 10 years, in 1973, another prominent social science research institute in Calcutta was established, the Center for Studies in Social Science Calcutta, or the CSSSC, with Barun De as the first director. In between CSDS and CSSSC, the Center for Political Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, was established in 1971. These three research institutes would later emerge as the leading centers of excellence in teaching and research in political science, along with several other branches of social sciences. In JNU CPS, there has been huge emphasis on normative political theory and political thought instead of rigorous empirical political science that one could notice in mainstream American universities. One must note that the center is called political studies instead of the popular name of political science that was fashionable and is still fashionable in most university departments in India. The use of political studies instead of political science was not an arbitrary adoption of a different nomenclature, but it was consciously given to suit the normative and historical approaches that shaped the teaching and research of the department. In Delhi University, the ideological leanings of faculty members was nothing different from JNU, with a balance between the liberal Congress and the broad left constituted by the Marxists, Leninists, and the Maoists, along with some free thinkers in the 1970s and 1980s. In CSDS, there was a strong tradition of behavioral political science with empirical approaches like structural functionalism, poll analysis, and election surveys. Those who were interested in normative political thought became more critical of Nehru and were interested in Gandhi, environmentalism, and alternative forms of modernity. And I have Ashish Nandi in mind. So you have Rajni Kothari, who was more, trained in structural functionalism, behavioral political science, election analysis, party systems, and you have Ashish Nandi, who is doing political thought, but critical of the Nehruvian state and more eulogizing Gandhi in terms of his research interests. By the time the left front came to power in Bengal in 1977, and the Congress was ousted from the central government, the decolonial trend was firmly grounded on the importance of using the vernacular medium of instruction in public education. The anti-emergency movement against Indira Gandhi's authoritarianism created a condition for a new set of subaltern leaders to emerge in the future. Hence, Lalu Prasad Yadav, Nitish Kumar in North India, Narendra Modi from Gujarat were products of the anti-emergency movement. In Bengal, it was during the anti-Indira agitations that Mamata Banerjee, as a student leader, then just experienced her first flirtation with street politics, defending the Congress against its political rivals. When the left front came to power, it was involved in a struggle with its detractors to impose compulsory vernacular medium of instruction in the school and the universities. It was a genuine attempt to democratize universities, but in the name of democratization, a form of crude egalitarianism emerged in the domain of higher education. Such crude egalitarianism later became the general template of public universities in India in the last 3 decades. Now, this research project will compare the similarities and differences in the curriculum structures, research interests of the faculty members, and teaching methods in the departments of political science in Calcutta, Hyderabad, which is Osmania, Pune, and Delhi from 1948 to 2019. Along with such a concentrated focus on the 4 departments, located in 4 distinct regions of the country, the research will highlight 3 centers: the CSDS, the CPS, and CSSSC. At the same time, it will also look at whether the political scientists in Calcutta, Delhi, Hyderabad, and Pune were intervening in the public discourses as well. The parallel trends of the global and universal scholar of the discipline and the emergence of the public intellectual in response to local and national events are of particular interest to this research in the different contexts of regional and temporal differences. It is important to locate the genealogy and evolution of the discipline of political science and the politics of the disciplines in contemporary India to note the impact of such disciplinary practices in the future course of educational policymaking in higher education. For example, how did the nationalist movement, in terms of an active interest in Indian constitutional studies, was later replaced by the parallel trends of liberal ideological underpinning of behavioralism and Marxism in the decade of 1970s? Did the political upheavals from late 1960s to late 1970s influence the disciplinary discourses of political science in India? How did the leading departments and centers specializing in political science manage to cope with the transition from an overwhelming presence of students hailing from elite and exclusive English educated classes in the middle decades of the 20th century, with the presence of new subaltern groups trained in vernacular medium of instruction from the 1990s? What were the research interests of the Indian political scientists from the 1990s when Mandal, Mandir, and Market simultaneously emerged in the Indian political scene? Now I come to the another next section, or which is the final broad section of the paper: globalization and global universities in the Asian century. In 1993, the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, or MAHE, gained the status of a private deemed university. It has its origins in India's first private medical college, the Kasturba Medical College, established in 1953, and the private engineering college, Manipal Engineering College, in 1957. In 2007, MAHE came to identify itself as Manipal University. The university website proudly announces that it has off campuses in Mangalore and Bangalore and offshore campuses in Dubai, UAE, and Melaka, Malaysia. Truly Asian. Part of the Manipal group, the university is ISO 9001-2008 and ISO 14001-2004 certified, and has won the prestigious IMC Ramkrishna Bajaj National Quality Award and the International Asia Pacific Quality Award in 2007-8. The Manipal Group, a pioneer in higher education services with a 60-year-old legacy of excellence, also owns and operates campuses in Sikkim and Jaipur in India and in Nepal, Malaysia, and Antigua in the Caribbean. This is like Global South. In April 2000, two leading industrialists of India, Mr. Mukesh Ambani and Mr. Kumar Mangalam Birla, prepared a report as part of the Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's special subject group on policy framework for private investment in education, health, and rural development that was submitted to the Council of Trade and Industry of the Government of India. The report submitted by Mr. Ambani as the convener and Mr. Birla as a member of the special group was later published in late 2003 in an academic journal, months before the BJP-led NDA government was ousted from power in the central government. The report made a perceptive observation about the state of affairs in the education sector of India by the turn of the 20th century in the following words. While the larger, and I quote, while the larger world embraces the information age, the world of education in India encompasses different worlds that live side by side. One world includes only a fortunate few with access to modern institutions, computers, internet access, and expensive overseas education. A second world wants to maintain status quo. Teachers, administrators, textbook publishers, students all have reasons to prefer things to remain as they are or change only gradually. The third world struggles with fundamental issues such as no books, wrong books, teachers desperately in need of training, teachers with poor commitment, rote learning of irrelevant material, classrooms with 100 students, dirty floors, and no toilets. India cannot hope to succeed in the information age on the back of such three disparate worlds, unquote. While the Ambani-Birla report recommended for universal and free primary education, it did made crucial recommendations for commercialization and privatization of higher education, along with depoliticizing the university space. For example, out of 25 recommendations, 6 were directly asking to follow the policies of privatization and depoliticization. Those recommendations are of the following. Number 1, encourage schools of learning to constantly upgrade content and facilities to make them more market oriented. Number 2, fund infrastructure for government schools, buildings, telecom networks, and computers on a priority basis. Progressively reduce funding for universities and make them adopt the route of self-sufficiency to achieve this. 3, give institutions not depending on government for funding or having low levels of funding to have operational freedom and flexibility to innovate. 4, legislate a private university bill to encourage establishment of new private universities in the fields of science and technology, management and finance areas. 5, allow foreign direct investment in education. To begin with, limit this to science and technology areas. 6, enable all political parties to come to an understanding that they will keep away from universities and educational institutions, ban any form of political activity on campuses of universities and educational institutions. Of late, the Birla Ambani report has gained some resonance under the current India government led by Modi, along with opposition from the left, since it is opposed to the crux of the recommendations, which is total commercialization and corporatization of the education system. In 2015, Professor Amartya Sen, in his book The Country of First Boys, had expressed his displeasure with the BJP-led NDA government's move to intervene in the academic matters of Nalanda University. The modern avatar of Nalanda University, established in 2014, is an example of several new initiatives in India to create global universities in the Asian century. Other prominent examples in order of their dates of foundation are Amity University in Noida 2005, Lovely Professional University Jalandhar in Punjab 2005, OP Jindal Global University Sonipat in Haryana 2009, South Asian University New Delhi 2010, Azim Premji University Bangalore 2010, Shiv Nadar University Greater Noida UP 2011, Ashoka University Sonipat Haryana 2014, Bennett University Greater Noida UP 2016, SRM University SR Munjal University Sonipat Haryana 2013, Flame University Pune 2015, Kriya University Sri City Andhra Pradesh 2018, and Plaksha University Mohali Punjab that will start from 2021. From late 1990s to the first decade of 2000s, along with new private universities, public universities were also guided by commercialization, where the rule of the market defines the priorities and functioning of the public university. This is a trend that could be seen in some African universities in 1990s and early 2000s, notably in the Makerere University, Kampala, as recently demonstrated by Mahmoud Mamdani. Mamdani's book, Scholars in the Marketplace, which precisely deals with this issue. In the case of our eastern neighbor, Bangladesh, the commercialization of higher education was in fact older and could be traced in the decade of 1980s, followed by a formal passing of the Private University Act by the Bangladesh Parliament in 1992. However, commercialization is now coupled with government's political intervention in the academic and policy matters of universities. In fact, there have been reports where ruling parties' IT cells have been actively engaged in vilifying and targeting certain universities on social media platforms. The government intervention in deciding academic matters of Nalanda University was only one example among many about how democratically elected governments have scant regards for disagreement in the domain of academic freedom. Sen has been a very consistent critique of religious fundamentalist forces and a defender of the liberal democratic tradition. He was humiliated and was almost compelled to quit the chancellorship of the modern Nalanda that was to recreate the values of ancient India's quest for learning from heterogeneous sources. It is now common knowledge that democracy is not only about the simple principle of the rule of the majority. Democracy's substantive elements also comprise of the values of plurality and dissent, which are essential to achieve excellence in any domain, including the university. Government intervention in academic affairs in India's higher education has become a common practice with regards to recruitment and policy decisions. It jeopardizes the making of a diverse team of academics in the everyday functioning of universities. Autonomy and democracy in Indian universities have been the casualty in the last few decades. The institutional head must be like an umpire or a referee, keeping a safe and respectable distance from the political leadership. On the other hand, the political leadership must also refrain from meddling with the academic and policy matters of the university, including the Honorable Governor, the Chancellor of several universities, at least in our case in Bengal. The taxpayers' money is used to run publicly funded universities and research institutes in India. Thus, it is only fair to demand public scrutiny, accountability, and transparency. However, campus violence in the last few decades in some reputed Indian universities has vitiated the academic environment of the higher education scene. Violence is an end to politics, getting rid of politics. Politics should be concerned about the idea of good for the many instead of the few. One takes refuge to violence only when there are no substantive arguments to convince others. Political leadership over the last few decades has lacked confidence and has often taken the interventionist route to capturing university campuses. In recent years, student protests have often turned into violent protests without any sense of substantive politics based on clarity of thought in articulating democratic demands. In many cases, such violent protests are equivalent to low level anarchism and lumpenism when compared with the ideological motivation that were driving the student protests globally during the late 1960s from Paris, the anti Vietnam agitations, and in India, the Naxalite movement. From the second decade of this century, a root form of protest is arising from the post-liberalization generation that is increasingly becoming self-centered with an impulsive behavioral pattern. It is a generation that is desperately looking for instant success and have a stiff attention-seeking syndrome in a context when the old division between left-wing and right-wing politics have been narrowing on many counts, and in a context of global rise of unemployment among university graduates. However, it reflects upon the teachers of educational institutions as well. As teachers, are we also not supposed to own up what students do? Are we only teaching the syllabus and nothing more? There is an immense need for collective introspection within Indian universities. Such introspection is also required for institutional heads and the political class to separate academics and government intervention. A brief anecdote from Amartya Sen's historiography in the Leprix Nobel would summarize a model of a fascinating education institution. Sen writes that as a student, he applied to Trinity College, Cambridge, because three remarkable economists of very different political views coexisted there. The Marxist Maurice Dobb and the conservative neoclassicist Dennis Robertson did joint seminars, and Trinity also had Piero Sraffa, a model of skepticism of nearly all the standard schools of thought. The peaceful, indeed warm coexistence of Dobb, Robertson, and Sraffa was quite remarkable given the feuding in the rest of the university. Later, Sraffa told Sen, and I quote, a nice anecdote about Dobb's joining of Trinity on the invitation of Robertson. When asked by Robertson whether he would like to teach at Trinity, Dobbs said yes enthusiastically, but he suffered later from a deep sense of guilt in not having given Robertson the full facts. So he wrote a letter to Robertson apologizing for not having mentioned earlier that he was a member of the Communist Party, supplemented by the statement, a rather English statement, that he would understand perfectly if, in view of what Robertson were to decide, that he, Dobb, was not a fit person to teach Trinity undergraduates. Robertson wrote a one-sentence reply. Dear Dobb, so long as you give us a fortnight's notice before blowing up the chapel, it will be all right. That was Cambridge in the early 1950s, less than an hour train journey from London. Why our public universities should not look for such heterogeneity and heterodoxy along with gentle humor? Both Oxford and Cambridge, along with the Russell Group of universities in the United Kingdom, the private Ivy League universities in the United States of America, many great North American and European universities, and I have been told that even Chinese universities do care for plurality. If India wants to have a sophisticated higher education system, then it has to adopt a new model of mixing fantastic private and public universities while updating the curriculum and make it suitable to the demands of a fast-changing 21st century, along with respectfully adopting the principle of plurality in university community. Along with building select elite universities, the importance of skill enhancements, navigation with new technologies, and innovation in learning and teaching methods that will make students capable for getting 21st century jobs will be the vital contribution for policymakers of higher education in India. But what is remarkably noticeable is that at present, a majoritarian nationalist regime with an authoritarian leader at its helm, backed by a fascist force, is enmeshed into an ideological vengeance in the form of taking revenge against all kinds of progressive academicians and student activists. The first casualties of such a vindictive attitude were various public universities and research institutes with the active intervention of the union government after the 2014 Lok Sabha elections. Bengal is still far away from Delhi's ire, but it is caught between managing new district based universities and the vernacular medium of instruction that has created a jumbled up lingua franca of mixing English and vernaculars not only in content but also in form while writing and speaking. There has been no systematic effort with a grand vision to build proper public and elite private universities in Bengal in this century that could be seen in parts of North and South India. I have already named some North and South Indian universities earlier in this paper. Bengal still has great potential to not only uplift the quality of the existing public institutions, but also create a new private elite university that could be a game changer in the higher education sector in India. After assessing the duration of decolonization in the middle decades of the 20th century with an example of the discipline of political science, the after effects of the decolonial education in the late 1970s and throughout 1980s and 1990s, followed by the paths of economic liberalization, privatization of higher education, and globalization, in an era of global academia in the post 1990s decades, I have one simple question to ask while sitting in Kolkata, a city which was once the second capital of an empire that ruled the world for nearly 2 centuries. The question is of the following. Do Kolkata's regional capital, India's big capital, and the Bengali cultural capital together have the appetite to take the risk of creating a world-class elite private university in Bengal that could fulfill the demands of surviving and thriving the life skills in the 21st century? The simple answer to the above question is that at this moment, there has been no such initiative in Bengal. The reasons are few. First, Bengal does not have a regional capital that may take such a risk with a grand vision to set up a university which could match up to the global standards of top ranking global universities in the next few decades. Secondly, for setting up such a university, getting land is an issue. The fragmented nature of land in Bengal, along with the state being the highest density of population among major states with a huge surplus population, dependent on land and land related economy, getting one big chunk of land near Kolkata is a significant impediment. Thirdly, the capital flight in Bengal for decades have made big capital of India to not take enough risk for investing in big ticket projects. Universities are lesser priority for big capital given the lackluster record of India's big capital in matters of philanthropy and even in corporate social responsibility. Finally, the Bengali cultural capital is still deeply immersed into government sector and it has academic and ideological stakes in the public sector education. After all, Bengal is the last bastion of state-led higher education. The plebeian classes that have gained political power in the state have benefited from the vernacular education and will resist any move to privatize either existing public universities or pay higher fees in new private universities. Already, the government of West Bengal in the last 2 decades has played an active role in regulating fees in private schools and colleges. The class division that one can notice between the students in public universities and a number of elite private universities in parts of North and South India cannot be seen in present-day Bengal. Decolonization has certainly met the global trend of globalization in the last 3 decades, but decolonization and its after effects are still the broad platform of resistance to privatization and globalization in the form of sustenance of state-sponsored higher education and the vernacular mode of education. Will the deepening of decolonization project in higher education necessarily ensure the liberal values of academic freedom, lack of governmental intervention in the academic and administrative matters of universities? The experience so far is rather bitter. I have no answer whether decolonization and autocracy are entirely intertwined, since that has been the prophecy of several liberal apologia for empire, with the argument that decolonization will only re-establish third world dictatorships. However, given the recent global rise of authoritarianism in both the erstwhile colonial states and the colonies, probably such an allegation is not valid today. In such a context of the rise of authoritarianism and lack of academic freedom in university spaces, the combined lack of the scholar of the combined task of the scholar of the discipline and the public intellectual in our times is to use democracy as a site of struggle to ensure academic freedom, articulate democratic demands of the academic community, and open up channels of dialogue and consultation with the administration, the student community, and the teachers of universities. Today, the internet revolution has created a democratic space for such active public engagement where concerns for democracy, autonomy, and introspection could be discussed in detail. This is at least the first step for a renewal of a global movement with the demand for a critical space necessary for academic freedom. Such an effort needs to be collective in the form of a global awakening in addressing the issues of global academia, where the decolonial academic community could virtually meet the globalized academic elites through the technological apparatus and could learn from each other. In other words, the process of globalization in the form of time-space compression has now ensured through technological innovation that the global universities will no longer need to pay hefty airfare to listen to native informants of the decolonial world. The universities in the decolonial world will also not match such generosity to hear the superstar speakers of the elite universities of the West. But the COVID-19 experience showed us that the academic community could interact and learn from each other through the virtual mode. This is a politics which is still in the making, a new politics of pedagogy through negotiation and navigation of the digital space across globe. Hopefully, some political scientists in India would chronicle this emerging new politics of pedagogy by situating it in a technologically driven, fast-changing world of artificial intelligence, robotics, and supercomputers together constitutive of the politics of and politics in the future. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful talk. We get very seldom chances to listen to such talks because we are students of history, and it's a very great thing to listen to you. So there are some questions from the audience. Rakesh is asking how India's foreign policy transferred from centering Russia to centering USA, and how this transformation affected in India's national politics.
Well, this is a question which is coming from a student. Can you introduce Rakesh? What is his background, and because that will be
Yes, sir,
helpful
Rakesh.
for me to.
Rakesh is a student of history of UG1 Presidency University.
Correct. Okay. So yes. So if you look at the immediate decades of post 47, which is in the 1950s and 1960s, India was adopted a policy of non-alignment movement, as you know, which is under the leadership of Prime Minister Nehru. And this was the peak period of decolonization period, 1950s and 1960s. The Bandung Conference was there, and then this whole alignment, the G77, there were several initiatives that India took an independent foreign policy. In fact, at that time, the main opposition was the left, and so the left was critical of Nehru's economic policies, but they were not that critical of Nehru's foreign policy because India took a very independent foreign policy. In the international arena, the Soviet invasion in Hungary in 1956 actually, in fact, strengthened Nehru's argument that look, we can't actually always, while opposing United States, we can't also blindly follow the Soviet Union, because it's also an aggressor. So the independent foreign policy, the national or the non-alignment foreign policy, was roughly the major policy that India followed. And so, and during the Bangladesh War in 1971, in fact, there was strong anti-US kind of stance, because there have been several writings where the US actually supported the Pakistani establishment. Pakistan, right from the beginning, was a US ally. And it had its impact in Bangladesh, in the social science in Bangladesh. In fact, I didn't discuss this in my paper, but my research shows that a lot of behavioral political science, particularly empirical political science, was very much earlier, was much earlier. It came to Bangladesh in Dhaka and Rajshahi than in India. So that particular foreign policy was there. But once the Soviet Union was gone, and post 1991, Nehru's foreign policy was no more relevant. And post 1991, you had a lot of changes in India's domestic politics. As I pointed out, that you have the rise of a far right party in and around the Mandir politics. At the same time, in the economic policies, there's liberalization, so opening up the economy. Although there's this entire policies of liberalization and privatization was already, one could argue, and there have been some literature which argues that it started from the late 1970s onwards, particularly during the Janata Party experience, and then in the Rajiv Gandhi's regime with telecom sector, and Sam Pitroda and all, they have came. So these are all part of the process which all took shape in the post 1991. So July 1991, when Manmohan Singh presented its budget speech, which formally actually opened up the Indian economy. Now, once the Soviet Union is no more, India had to exist, and it also has had to do trade and commerce, and also do military, deals regarding trade with military establishment, and particularly buy, you know, tanks or aircrafts and all sort of military equipments. And at the same time, it also had, trade relations apart from the larger, this whole humanitarian kind of liaisons that it had to maintain. Uh, so that actually made Indian foreign policy tilted slowly over the decades towards the pro-US foreign policy. And there has been a lot of literature on that. But what is interesting is that by the first decade of 2000s, two poles, have also emerged apart from United States. You have China on the one side, and you have Russia on the other. And this is interesting, that how China was already emerging, and it is something which is a major challenger of the United States at now. But at the same time, you have Russia, which is also emerging, and you have the Russian President Vladimir Putin now has actually made an amendment of the constitution, which made him actually the new czar of Russia. I mean, he could actually be at the helm of Russian political establishment for life. So, and it is possible and age is still on his side, that it is possible that he could be someone who would actually surpass Stalin's long duration as the head of the state of the former Soviet Union. So, so we have to see how that pans out. But what is interesting is that in today the world is actually moving towards a multipolar world. It is, this momentary euphoria in the decade of the 1990s which Francis Fukuyama you said that the end of history because it is the Soviet Union is gone and it's the the liberal this whole liberal euphoria that liberal world is the only uh, alternative. But I think that has been severely damaged. First with 9/11, and second with 2008 financial crisis, which has now had its impact and after effects still now, and with this current epidemiological crisis of the COVID-19, you can see that US is actually a declining empire now. Now, so India is planning its foreign policy very cleverly. So it has to carry forward its own national interests, but at the same time, it can't. It also has an understanding that Britain is already gone. You have Soviet Union, which has been fragmented, but you have Putin's Russia, which you can't ignore, and you have a powerful Chinese neighbor, but you have an isolationist president in the United States in the form of Donald Trump, and he is I mean, he is a destabilizing factor. I mean, he doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, sometimes he says, but he's inconsistency to the power infinity. Sometimes he praises North Korea. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he says one thing in one country and in another country, and it's not like he is. I mean, he's saying Pakistan to one thing and India to one thing. But I'm just saying that even within the same pole, I mean, suppose in Japan he does something which is atrocious. So what I'm trying to say is that India also knows that that US is someone which is now very unpredictable. Now, what is in this context, what India could do? I mean, I think this is my personal opinion: is that this entire independent foreign policy line should be actually pursued because we are in a multipolar world, and where national interests should be foregrounded. But this national interest should be foregrounded in the context of trade and commerce. Now, what is increasingly happening is that cultural issues like the national this NRC or this whole refugee thing with the Rohingya. I think these things are now over the last few years. These things have taken precedence over matured foreign policy, and because of lack of trade and commerce being the focal point of foreign policy, your cultural issues have actually gained more attention in determining foreign policy. And I think that has actually created a lot of problems because suppose if you look at South Asia, then we have actually lost a lot of our dependent neighbors. At one point of time during the UPA regime, we had very good relations with Nepal. Nepal is certainly now going much closer to China. China has already bought Sri Lanka by giving loans, and then they have actually now almost de facto acquired an important port in Sri Lanka. Bangladesh is too irritated because of all this entire NRCCA, this kind of business. So we have actually, and China is heavily investing in Bangladesh. So we have actually no dependable neighbors, because these are neighbors which we have, because of our own wrong policies, we have actually made them closer to China, which is a really matter of worry. A matured foreign policy would have actually would have made us more healthy and fruitful dialogue with our neighbors, because as you know that we can't actually select our neighbors, because you are not, you and I can actually select neighbors, human beings, provided that you have a certain kind of resources. Today you are located in some place, tomorrow you might actually relocate. But a nation state, territoriality, that you can't actually, you know, we can't wait for tectonic shifts, which comes maybe after millions of years, right? So since you can't choose your neighbors, and certainly you can't choose neighbors in matters of international politics and foreign policy, your foreign policy should be more matured in terms of dialogue, and try to do business and commerce, and then these cultural exchanges. But if you think that your domestic cultural issues, and then you are hell bent on something that which has gone into your head for several decades, and which is a absolutely irrational way of thinking, uh, that that you are a country of a Hindu victim vote or a majoritarian victim vote. I mean, I think that's a narrative which is being carefully crafted by those who didn't have enough contribution in India's anti-colonial movement. And even during the decades of decolonization, there has not been any constructive approach in the making of a modern India. It was only after the fall of the Congress Party, particularly in North India and Western India, that this particular force, which largely follows majoritarian nationalism, and this majoritarian nationalism is not based on any linguistic nationalism, but on a religious nationalism. They have somewhere gained momentum because of a vacuum created by the collapse of the Congress. You see, and they have this whole entire idea that anything which the Congress did was wrong. So we have to actually do something which is completely anti-Congress, and hence this entire anti-Nehru and anti-Gandhi kind of feeling. And I can understand that one of their prime leaders, and today's prime minister, is a product of the Navnirman movement in Gujarat and the entire anti-Indira Gandhi emergency movement. That is certainly that is the case, but then there were also other anti-Congress leaders who later became an ally of the Congress, and Lalu Prasad and Nitish Kumar were some examples. Nitish Kumar, of course, moves from one party to another, choosing alliances. But Lalu Yadav was someone who was a product of the anti-emergency movement, the JP movement, but later on became an ally of the Congress. So it has so I think in terms of maturity, what the current establishment is doing is something which is disastrous, because once you say that this is a Congress Mukt Bharat or something like that, then I think that's a problematic thing, because Congress also did a lot of positive things. I mean, modern India cannot be imagined without Nehruvian institutions, without Nehruvian foreign policy. Suppose if today I know that Indian universities are much lower in terms of global ranking, and Chinese universities have been more, have actually gone up in the last 20, 30 years because of their strong focus. And they also had a strong vernacular mode of instruction, which actually helped them. But of course, huge investments in the in the R&D or on the human resource development that the Chinese establishment did. But even today, in terms of the ranking, your top ranking universities, the IITs, the Indian Institute of Science, the JNU, these all came during the Congress regime. Some of them were actually did came during Nehru's regime. I think this entire idea of completely denying Nehru and its foreign policy is simply stupid. Uh, so I don't know whether I have really directly answered the question, but I think the major answer is that that the shift from this NAM to US and China, or to Russia particularly, I think is something that India has to carefully adopt, because now today is a world where we are actually really in a multipolar world instead of a bipolar world during the Cold War regime, or the unipolar world, which is roughly, I would say, that unipolar world was very brief in the 1990s maybe. From 2000s, it's no more a unipolar world. Once Putin is there and once China emergence was clear, we are no more into a unipolar or a bipolar world. We are truly into multipolar world. Whether India is going to become a major player in this multipolar world, that depends on how we carve out our own foreign policies, which should be again based on the interests of our mutual interests of our trade and commerce and cultural exchanges. Yeah, you can go to the next question.
Yes. So Himadri says, what is your views regarding the future of Indian education system, considering the current education policy?
Uh, well, I have a very grim view of India's education system on the one side, but at the same time, I also think that there are certain issues. There are certain areas where India can do well, given the fact that we still have a younger population who and we have. Uh, well, we have a country who actually produce a lot of great scientists and historians and economists and statisticians and whatnot, even astronauts, and so I think what is this, that you have a brilliant Indian student who moved to the top graded UK, European, or US universities, and then they do well, and they really made their mark. They succeed and they excel and they contribute into their own disciplines. Uh, but but why that particular student, when he or she is based in India, uh, we don't hear much about them. It's possible that there are, of course, I'm not denying that there are a lot of Indian academics who have been who excelled globally, but then that number is very few. Um, Most of Indian academics who have actually contributed in their disciplines either did their highest degree, which is the doctorate or the PhD or a DPhil, depended on the university that you are registered. Uh, uh, did their highest academic degree at the university abroad. Some of them stayed there, some of them came back, but major research degree that actually came from outside India. Now, this has been a trend. I don't know whether this trend might change in the long run, but what is actually happening in India is that no government in India, whether it is uh, from the 1950s onwards, uh, have actually given enough concentration in terms of spending in higher education. So, higher education has not been that a priority in India as far as government expenditure is concerned. So that we need to actually get that kind of real focus by the government. But what we are interested is more investments in military equipments and military budget, even during the decades where we didn't have major wars, like, so let's say in the, immediately after 1960, 71, there have been no major wars. Like, so the entire 80s, the 90s, up till 1999 in Kargil, we didn't have major war. Okay, after Kargil, again a very slow and a peaceful, relatively peaceful period. There are, of course, occasional skirmishes in borders, but we didn't have to actually spend so much on military equipment and military expenditure. But we could have actually improved our uh, cyber security, some other kinds of, which is now going to be the major thing. But also at the same time invest hugely in the R&D, which has not been the case. Controlling corruption is another issue. So you can actually mobilize funds. Then, in terms of the tax GDP ratio, our tax GDP ratio, India is one of the lowest. So we don't tax the rich much. So which actually creates a huge issue in terms of getting funds for higher education. So yes, so India, so far Indian education system, the higher education system is not that great up to, if you compare with Chinese universities, which is really quite emerging. I'm giving an example of China because roughly 47 we got politically independent. 49 you had the Chinese Communist Party taking charge. It's our neighbor. We have largely peasant population in both the countries, and yet if we compare where China is now and where we are now, then it's quite bizarre. And I'm giving you that in 1980s, Sen gave an example where in Jibon Jatra Orthaniti, in the Bengali book, Sen gave an example where uh, higher education in university graduates in India, we had 8% of university graduates in the 1980s. China had only 1%. So I'm not sure whether we need so many universities, because a lot of people don't need university education, and that, because what we are getting is that we are just giving a very traditional form of education. And traditional, I mean, not a toll or a pathshala education, but I'm just saying an education system which was still caught up in the 1950s and 1960s. You see, an ordinary graduate in basic sciences or ordinary graduate in BA arts or something like that, but not some skill enhancements or some kind of IT, ability to negotiate and navigate through the technology. So we don't need this kind of university. What we need is skill enhancements, vocational training, some other kinds of innovative skills that university graduates could get or even not get. Just after class 12 they could just do something else. And we don't need so many universities, because you invest in so many universities, some students now will take student loans to get into these private universities of big vision, small vision, medium vision, whatever. But I'm just, and then they don't have any future. So this is some kind of a making stupid of the entire education system, as well as the fooling students and their guardians. So I don't find that this is honest enough. um, just give me a second. I need to charge my phone, but we can actually, I can hear you, so I'm just putting off the camera, and we can hear you. Yeah, tell me. Yeah.
The next question is from Devojoti. He's asking,
Yes.
as you have said, that globalization has a great impact on the higher education in India. My question is that we see during this pandemic, online education becomes a great challenge for India. So, what are the challenges and opportunities that government or institutions should take to provide a better online education system?
Now, one issue is that, first of all, this whole entire business of digital India. Now, I don't know whether digital India is something mm, which is creating. Of course, it's creating a huge impact in terms of uh, getting the right kind of resources. But at the same time, what and by resources I mean that cheap mobile phones and free data. So that's the basic things that you need, which is there. But at the same time, you also have a digital divide. So what we are today, you know we are into this whole digital space, but it's still a very middle class, upper middle class kind of audience that we are speaking. We all belong from this particular class. Some of us who might not belong, or maybe come from lower middle class or a poor class background, but still has a cheap mobile and a free data, which they could now afford. Um, they might actually become absorbed into a middle class family once he or she passes to after university and get a job, right? But what my real worry is that, do we actually need uh, so many universities just because the uh, just because that we need to be like the old elites, you see. So that's what I'm trying to understand, that suppose, let me give you an example. Now, why there is so much hue and cry about Narendra Modi's formal degrees, right? And one could still remember that in the 1980s, particularly 1985, I think, there was a huge issue on Bengal Chief Minister's formal degree, right? Now, if you think from this perspective, that the middle class, the educated middle class, will always point out that, look, these are people who actually come from a vernacular medium of instruction. Their mode of, they are more comfortable in their local vernacular medium of language. They are trained in that. They can read and write those languages, but then they want to be like us. They want to be like, what Modi famously said, that this is political science in all subjects, something like that. This was something which is a very interesting degree that he said. And Ms. Banerjee had a PhD from a university which was not existent at that time, right? So and that was a huge issue. No, but I'm saying that, so that was a no. So basically, so that was a right. So what I'm trying to say is that this is something which is interesting, that you have a middle class critique of these group of politicians. Okay, so this is one way. But at the same time, if you look at from the other side, what is the necessary of both Modi and Mamata to be like the elites? But they could be just comfortable. They could just say that, look, we are someone who don't have a formal PhD or degree, but we are fine with it because you elites don't matter, because in terms of votes, and we don't get your votes, we don't care about your votes. They could just say that, right? I mean, I still remember that Lalu Prasad Yadav, who had actually a law degree, and the middle class was so critical about Lalu that there was so many jokes were there. Even when he was a very successful railway minister, there were so many jokes. But this is again a middle class arrogance towards a very subaltern politician who has firm commitment for India's secularism. He might be corrupt, but that's a very different issue. But who is not a corrupt? Let's say I'm not defending corruption, but I'm just saying the corruption is ingrained in all political parties. So that's not the issue. But what I'm trying to say that you have a new set of leaders who came from vernacular backgrounds, who are not well trained in English education. And Lalu, despite the fact that he had a formal law degree, was speaking the language in tone and manner of a people where the ordinary poor person could identify. Apart from the dynamics of that, he comes from a middle class, intermediate caste. This is something which is all throughout in India, in many Indian states, where the intermediate caste actually control rural politics. That has been still the case in many Indian states, not all the Indian states, but at least in a number of Indian states. But this is interesting, that why Modi and Mamata, they want to be like the elites. And this is where the interesting phenomena of how a decolonial vernacular leader, a product of decolonization, a product of vernacular medium of instruction, want to be like the globalized elite. You see, or maybe an older elite who was who were like the brown sides and all. Why we Kolkata need to be like London? This is an interesting thing, right? No, because so that's so I'm just saying that this is how you have decolonization, but at the same time you have remnants of the colonial legacy in your blood and soil and your mode of thinking. So this is a puzzle that I have. I'm yet to resolve this puzzle. That why is it? You could just say that, look, I'm fine because I don't care for you. You elites, sir, you have 1 or 2% votes. I don't know why you need to be like a Bhadralok, or you are what you are. And just be confident with what you are. If you are a Bhadralok, you say that, yeah, I'm a Bhadralok. I'm an elite. Nothing to hide. It's not a problem. Is it a problem if somebody is born and brought up in an elite family, or have earned or gained or have actually come, through social mobility has become an elite? But at the same time, is it a problem if someone is born and brought up in a non-elite background, and just be saying that, okay, just be what you are? So in terms of I think this is a real issue that we want to address, that whether you need a universal mass higher education. I don't think that we need universal mass higher education. We certainly need universal free compulsory primary education. We also certainly need universally free compulsory secondary education, but I don't think that we need universal compulsory higher education. In fact, the entry to higher education should be so strict and so stringent that we only get the best quality of students. And my proposal is that instead of bringing new universities, because this is not a feat to achieve, this at some point of time, after some point of time, it will be uh, it will be difficult to manage so many universities and so many colleges, because every state has financial constraints, and given the fact that India's fiscal, the federalism issue, and we are not dealing with the cooperative federalism in terms of a favorable fiscal policy towards the states. Rather, what is increasingly emerging in India is that central government has more cash reserves, central government has more powers in terms of more financial powers. So managing so many state universities and state colleges is a real issue. Why do you think that in West Bengal, the seventh CPC, which is the sixth CPC, is actually implemented so late? I mean, the West Bengal government didn't have that money. But how could they get money? Because the central government has more money, and it's not just a matter of only West Bengal state, but several other states also had huge issues. So I don't know whether we need so many public universities and so many public colleges. Uh, so this is an issue that I'm trying to understand. We need a balance between some existing quality public universities uh, and building of new elite private universities. Some of them I have already named. So Ashoka or Kriya or Plaksha or Shivnadar or Jindal. These are very interesting, innovations and very interesting initiatives. Uh, so yes, that's fine. But then we also at the same time we also need our presidency university or IITs or the IIScs or the Jadavpur or the existing quality public university. We could actually enhance the quality of those universities. So yeah.
So next question, Orithra Roybormon
Yeah.
saying, how can we envision an idea of political science from an interdisciplinary approach?
Uh, Well, in higher social sciences, I'm saying that in the after your post graduation, when you enter into MPhil and PhD level, already you need, by the time you are into your master's level, you are already into doing something interdisciplinary. In fact, at your undergraduate level, you do something interdisciplinary. So you have an honors subject or a major subject, but at the same time, you have to opt some. In our time, it was past subject, but your time it's like taking minor subjects, right? Or core courses and some other courses, depending upon the universities that you are registered. So your optionals and your main courses. So the interdisciplinary training, I think, is already there right from your undergrad days. And political science is a part of the larger social sciences. But what is now interesting is that what is we need to think more is that not only just link political sciences with other social sciences, but also have a dialogue with sciences. Suppose I just give you an example. Suppose uh, if the moon mission would have been successful, now the surplus population, those who could actually afford, maybe in the long run, in next few decades, could have gone to the moon, right? Now, in terms of the point of view of governance and policy making, there is a huge implications, and political scientists could actually think in terms of matters of governance, policy making, public policy, right? Similarly, political economy, which is again a part of political science and economics, they could think in terms of how the surplus population could actually go to moon or some other planets. So in terms of how uh, how political economists once argued that during the period of colonization, uh, how a surplus population from the old colonial center actually moved to faraway places like in the United States, later to become United States, but at the same Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So if your world population is emerging and you're growing, and at the same time it's these other issues of climate change and an epidemiological crisis. What about finding a new place other than world? Now, of course, then at that time there would be all these negotiations whether who will first go to moon, those who have more money, uh, those are issues. So it will be like something like during the colonial period, it was those who didn't have money were actually exported to all these faraway places. But now, if the I'm just saying that if the moon expedition would have been successful, it might be successful in the long run. Who knows? Then those who have actually money could now go to the other place just to be on the safe side, right? I mean, it's possible. Already UAE announced that they have this whole 2117 something mission to have a colony in moon, something like that. I was just looking at a news few days back. So I'm just saying that these are issues which political scientists could actually look at. Then this entire idea of this virtual space, in matters of political communication, you have journals in political communication and in media politics and all this whole entire social media is of course one, but then now we have a new pedagogy where I ended the paper that how we could actually meet over virtual space. Already this has been going on in the last 1 decade. So Skype was already there by late 2000s. People were already using Skype, where there were conferences and there were seminars via the Skype mode. But what is interesting is now so many apps are now coming that it has now becoming the new normal, and where we could actually but we could have this audience might be like somewhere in and around Calcutta, but it's possible that I could actually talk to someone who is sitting in the United States in a top university, and someone who might be in a Chinese university, in a very top Chinese university, could also speak. And this is a new way of online learning. I still remembered when I was teaching at Presidency University, I used to show Michael Sandel's Harvard lectures on justice, and these are online lectures, which is now given to a very top university in the US, a private university, Ivy League, Harvard University, where you have great teachers. At the same time, you have fantastic fresh undergraduates, and they were interacting with a very good teacher. But then at the same time, this is free for public consumption, right? Now you can learn from that. But imagine now you don't have recorded lectures, but then you can actually do it via online and virtual mode and virtual space. So this is a new politics of pedagogy. Now, who will have access to this? Because every apps have their own limitations. How many could get into these apps? How many are allowed in a particular session? All those things are there. Now there will be some rules of exclusion and inclusion, right? Now these are something which could be the new poles of research for new political scientists. So interdisciplinarity is not just thinking about only linking political science with history or what is happening in the discipline of economics and sociology and anthropology, but also to look at what is happening in basic sciences, in different modes of in different subjects, like in biotechnology or some other science and technology streams. I think this is something which modern universities of the 21st century must look at and push forward to that vision with interconnecting with several disciplines. And this is where the true 21st century university should look like. Yes.
Last question.
I have
Abhimanyu
20
Shen.
comments, but I have 20 comments, but there are several. I have 20 comments.
Yes, sir. Some are saying at the start of the lecture, some are saying good afternoon. These type of comments are also there, sir. So we are sorting it out. You, there seems to have been a problem.
Sorry, I just got out. Yeah. Huh.
Yes, sir, is back. Uh,
Yeah.
so some of the comments were filtered because some were greetings like good afternoon, this type of sorts. So that's why we have
Okay.
filtered some comments. So this is the last question. Obhimanyu Sen is asking, do you think public-private partnership model can be tried in higher education and research?
Yeah, but already you have public-private partnership in higher education and research. You could do more, because all the great universities in Europe and England and in the US, you have a lot of public-private partnership there. So that is one that could be there. So I am not against public-private partnership. In fact, the research that I'm doing is we got a institutional grant from Andrew Mellon Foundation, a very generous grant to 5 institutes. So this is from a foundation. So I don't have that kind of ideological stake, because I find these things a bit dodgy, in the sense that those who think that they are left because they think that they are all for public university or public education. Now that's a position, but then don't claim that then don't go to a Ivy League university or a private university in the United States and give lecture or seminars there, or you take teaching positions or research positions there, because then that would be a stupid thing. Because uh, if you're a left, you can only think in terms of your wage, which is your salary. So if you think that if you are getting enough good working conditions, and your salary, which is a kind of accumulated wage for your intellectual labor, then this entire division between public and private, that is absolutely a very old 20th century Cold War model. Because as you know, that in the Soviet Union, socialism essentially meant that the state owned education system, and state owned everything. So the major means of production, your factories and your offices and your education system and your health systems are essentially state owned. In other words, a nationalization of the private resources. But then that model, of course, it enhanced the living conditions for a huge number of people. It certainly delivered it's to a lot of people, actually gained from that kind of a model. But we don't have that system now. And it had its also a problem of party nomenclatura, you have bureaucratic controls, and that had its own pitfalls. So I'm not going into that now. But today we are in a world where I think this whole entire private versus public thing is a completely misnomer. There's no point of making the public as something which is bad and private as something as good, or from the left point of a very far left point of view, the private as something bad and the public as good. What we need to understand whether the system is efficient, and I think this is something which we need to understand, that whether if the system is efficient, and if a particular institution is efficient, if an institution is delivering to its promise, then whether it's public or private, that is immaterial. Now then there are issues of all this politicization of space. And I think I have some problems with the Birla Ambani report on the particular point of banning all political activities. I can understand that there's political parties intervening in student politics. That is something which is I still have some sympathies for that. Yes, political parties in terms of intervening inside the internal matters of a university is something which is wrong, and I'm in principle I believe in that kind of a position. But banning all political activities is certainly something which is again a very extreme form of far right kind of an argument, because if we understand politics in a very substantial form, then any articulation of any democratic demand is a political act. Suppose if students say that we have we need to have some water coolers in the student hostels, and this is a perfectly justifiable demand in a tropical country like India, then I think that demand is a democratic demand, but at the same time it's also a political act, right? Now you can't say that political activities completely is banned, because then if you start with such a premise, then the authority might say that, look, whether there will be water coolers or not will be the discretion of the authority. You see, so any space of a new political movement is completely stopped right from the very structure of the university will be like that if we follow the Birla Ambani report in toto. Okay, so I think that is something which is a real wrong. As far as investments in research and development and building universities, I don't have any problem, because private universities at the same time is also giving employment to a lot of fresh graduates, who need employment. So I'm fine with that, because I don't have that kind of a far left position to say that, look, any private university is something which is bad, right? Those who could afford higher fees, they are going to those universities, right? Those who can't afford, or those who think that, okay, they still want to be in a city where they have their parents, or for whatever reason they want to be, they don't want to move to a new university, okay, that's fine. But increasingly what is happening is that because of these private universities, we are increasingly having a class division in the student community. Public universities in India will increasingly become a place where the vernacular elites or the new subaltern groups who are first generation students might be, or the second generation maybe, they will increasingly come to these public universities, and elite section of students would actually go to the private universities. I can give you one example that in India, more often than not, I'm not saying that it's always, but more often than not, the class and the caste and the class and the Muslim minority, these are overlapping. So in terms of, suppose if you belong to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, OBC and Muslim minorities, then your probability of being poor are higher. I'm saying probability, okay? Probability is more higher. Now, most private universities, they don't implement the reservation policy in India. Amity Noida is an exception, but I'm just saying that this is something which is not many universities they have that kind of policy. They might have their own argument why not to implement, and whether they have lack of political movement inside the university on behalf of the faculty or the students, that's another matter. But I'm just saying that this is so far the structure that is in place. Now once the elite middle class and the upper middle class, because they are third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation, sixth generation learner, or maybe they have enough money in their parents' bank accounts, that or they can take risk from student loans, and then they know that they are able to repay those loans. They are increasingly moving to these elite private universities, and you can have a survey, and where you will I can bet that any survey will show that the representation from the marginalized groups and the Muslim minorities are relatively, and or not relatively, far more lower than the overrepresentation of the upper caste, upper class kind of groups in the private universities. Now, what will, suppose today we are talking in 2020, okay, but in 2040, I will be 60 years old. I will be still, hopefully, I will be still teaching and researching, and but then another 20 years, India's higher education will be completely different. Then, if this is a trend which we can follow, right? I can give you another example. In 1980s, JNU was full of elite, students. You can't imagine current JNUs, the profile of the current JNU students with the 1980s students. And a lot of people who were quite disillusioned with Calcutta University and the Naxalite period of the 1970s, they actually moved to JNU in the early 70s. They actually that was a new university in 1970, 69 to 71. Most of the departments were established. They moved to JNU as a new university, something new happening, something progressive happening. They moved there, and a number of people of them have now are quite established in various streams. Some of them have uh, become great academicians, some of them have become diplomats, some of them have become ministers, those who have, or some have become political leaders, those who were students in 1970s and 1980s. But from 1990s, JNU's entire character, the student profile, that actually changed. It has something to do with the upsurge of what political scientists call that second democratic upsurge, where the Dalit Bahujan politics not only emerging, but at the same time a new Dalit Bahujan students are also coming to JNU. And then you have progressive admission policy of JNU, where students coming from backward districts and backward castes, they get extra points in admission tests. And then of course you have the implementation of the reservation policy, which is already in place. Now, suppose if you compare JNU's 1970s, 80s with some of the new universities, private universities of 21st century, You see, the same thing is happening, but it is at a different level. You see, now you have a lot of new middle class and a lot of rich kids. They go to private universities. They think that this is a new university. It has a critical space. It has great faculty. It has good infrastructure. Whereas in public universities, we are not that sure, right? And some of the private universities have actually very stringent, uh, entry standards, comparable to, at least they are mimicking a lot of great American and Oxbridge universities. So I'm saying in another 20 years, it is possible that that these new private universities would be like the 1970s and 1980s of JNU, where the JNU was essentially elitist, compared to a lot of other public universities in that during that time. And so it's interesting that what we are going to, how Indian higher education sector would look like. In presidency, the student profile has changed so much. When we were students in the early in 2000, or some of our immediate seniors in 1990s, then the student profile of presidency, particularly in arts and humanities, sciences, you always get a lot of good students from the district schools, with vernacular medium of instruction. But in arts and humanities, particularly in social sciences and in history, and political science and sociology, the student profile has changed drastically. When I was a teacher there, I could actually see a lot of change. And today, what I can hear from some of my friends and colleagues, this is something uh, which is further shifted towards a more vernacularization of presidency. Right now, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, because there are there are positives and negatives of both. It's a good thing that a lot of first generation students coming from very backward districts, or coming from marginalized groups, are getting the taste of higher education and a quality education that presidency has to offer. But at the same time, we might probably losing a lot of good students from a very different strata, which were actually coming to presidency till a few years. We are getting good students from marginalized groups. We are also getting students from the intermediate castes and the middle class. But we are also losing a lot of good students from upper middle class and upper classes. Now, so at the end of the day, we are losing some good students, right? So I think this is somewhere which we need to understand how higher education is going to be uh, panning out in India, and whether state governments and central government, whether they have any serious thought about revamping the public sector higher education. Of course, a lot of public universities are really bad, but at the same time, it's also true that a lot of public universities are actually good, even in terms of, I don't believe in all these rankings and all, because rankings have very different parameters, and one way of ranking and another way of ranking are not comparable. But still, it did signify something. So your Jadavpur University and even Calcutta University, some departments of Calcutta University in our state, they actually did well of late in the national rankings. When presidency was a college, we were very good in the early 2000s, number one in science, number one in arts. I still remember India Today used to do a lot of rankings then. I'm sure that a lot of some of the departments of presidency are really good still. Some need to work well and or do well in for a much better to become a more good department. It's still possible, but in terms of moving out of some faculty members and good students from presidency is a real worry. So I think that is something which one has to address, that how that particular erosion or attrition of uh, various faculty members and students in quick succession. It's of course changing jobs and is a part of any university, right? That's not an issue. But the issue is that of the rate of attrition in terms of quick succession. So suppose in 2012 you have a certain number of faculty, and then in 2015 or 2016 you have a number of faculty actually move, then it means that your rate of attrition is quite high. Now, or in 2016 some people joined, and then in 2019 some people left. This means that your rate of attrition is quite high. So I think these are issues which one need to address, that how to retain good faculty at good university like presidency. Of course, it's a new university if you think about as a university, because before that it was college, and so it's essentially overgrown college, and then it became a university. If you look at its long history from 1855 and even longer from 1817, although there is a debate between whether 1870 to 1855 is the same institution with a college which was 1855, because in 1955 there was a 100-year centenary celebration of Presidency College. Because remember, in 1870 the Hindu College was not on the same place where the current presidency was. There was a gap between 3 months before the closing of the previous college, the Hindu College, and the new Presidency College. There was some issue. Then students who were not Hindus were not allowed to study at presidency. There were issues of teachers recruitment also. So there's a break. So there's a debate among historians whether these are same. But one still could argue that there are a lot of similarities also. There is also a long legacy. So one could say that, okay, if from 1817 to 2010, it's a college and an overgrown college of late. But from 2010 onwards, you have a new university which is carrying the legacy of an institution. But at the same time, it has to also understand that how to retain faculty members, to make them happy, to have more dialogue, and be more accommodative, and minimize political intervention. And that has been the larger argument that I've been doing, that this is something which both the institutional leadership and the political leadership has to collectively think, make an agreement that, look, political leadership should not intervene in the internal matters of the university. And similarly, the institutional leadership should also understand that, look, one has to take care of all the stakeholders, university administration, students, teachers, parents of the students might be, but so they could actually have a kind of a liaison and have a more dialogue and more fruitful way of making university great. So these are certain thoughts that I want to share with you.
Thank you for such a great lecture, and the questions were all answered, which were posed by the audience. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.